Hi all, thank you so much for joining this morning's conversation between Vanesa Gingold and Jenni Sorkin. My name is Anna Saigi and I am the director of Slash. Slash is a nonprofit visual art space located in the Dog Patch neighborhood of San Francisco on the unceded land of Ramaytush Ohlone people. Before we start, I'd like to mention that live captioning is available and you can enable it by clicking on the closed captions, the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. This morning's conversation will be followed by a short Q&A section, and we invite you to submit all your questions via the Q&A button. The conversation, including the Q&A, will be recorded, so if you wish to remain anonymous, please submit your questions anonymously. This event is happening in conjunction with Milkweed. It's an exhibition of hanging sculptures by Vanesa Gingold and is on view in Room for 2 more weeks until August 19th. Room is our small project space dedicated to showing work by local emerging artists. And the works are selected from annual open calls by a series of guest jurors. Vanesa's proposal was selected from our latest open call, which was juried by Jackie Im and Aaron Arbor. Before we hear more about Vanesa's practice, I will be reading today's participants' bios. Vanesa Gingold was born in Ukiah, California, and lives and works in Oakland, California. Gingold received her MFA from UC Santa Barbara and degrees in art and psychology from UC Davis. Vanesa has worked with numerous galleries, museums, and organizations, including the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Creativity Explored, San Francisco Art Commission, SF City College, and the University of California as an artist, curator, and teacher. Jenni Sorkin is Professor of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she is also affiliated faculty in the Departments of Art, Feminist Studies, and History. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her books include Life from Women, Ceramics, and Community, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2016, Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculpture by Women Artists, 1947-2016, published by Ukiah in 2016, and Art in California, published by Thames and Hudson in 2021. And with that, I will turn over the conversation to Vanesa and Jenni. Thank you so much to both of you for being here.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, thank you all for coming.
This is very exciting. Vanesa, it's lovely to see you. You were an MFA student here you finished in 2016, and you've been diligently working since then in the Bay Area.
Yes, thank you. All right.
Do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
Great. Okay, perfect. So this is one of the installation shots of your current exhibition, Milkweed, which is named for the toxic to other creatures, but not monarch butterflies. That is the main source or sustenance for monarch butterflies, which are an endangered species, but spend a lot of time traversing California. And could you talk a little bit about your sculptures, which are in flight, the way butterflies are in flight? And I assume Milkweed has a relationship to thinking through the translucency and transparency of your materials, and also the relationship between indoor and outdoor in your practice. Could you talk about that?
Yes. Well, yes, they kind of, one thing that brings the outdoors in is the shadows on the wall. And this whole body of work started with just looking at dappled light coming through trees. was kind of the origin of all of my hanging works, was to create this sort of sensation you have when you're walking through the forest and you see the light, or even if you're just inside and you have like light coming through a tree and projected kind of on the wall from the shadows. So it started with paper cutting and these kites, and over time just evolved and evolved and evolved into these forms that also take a lot from looking at butterflies, as you're saying, and plants, and kind of like the connections between plants and animals and people. All of the titles of the pieces, they're untitled, but then they also have like a subtitle that connects humans and animals. So with the title Milkweed, humans also produce milk and have this like a symbiotic relationship with their young. And so I was thinking about that as well. Some of the pieces are titled Iris, which is flower, and also, you know, the iris in your eye. So they all kind of go between those two things, like our relationship with nature and being part of nature.
And there's also a context in terms of the armatures for your work are made out of bamboo, which is a material that I think you have to soak in order to bend.
Yes, yeah.
So there's sort of a series of processes that require transformation in order to create this work, the same way that butterflies go through a kind of transformative experience from being caterpillars, building a chrysalis, and then transforming and spreading their wings. So could you talk a bit about how this work, I think people often want to know how this kind of sculpture is made, or how non-traditional abstract sculpture is created, what it takes to do process-based work like this. And you also have a background as a paper maker.
Yes, yeah. Paper making kind of came out of well, when I was a kid, I did a lot of things like basket weaving, and my first experience with paper making was in high school. I took a workshop and we were stripping mulberry branches, taking the inner bark, the xylem from the outer bark, and then beating it by hand. And the instructor who was teaching the workshop had to pull me away from this like very methodical process to actually get a chance to pull some sheets. And that was my first experience with paper making, but kind of left it behind for a while in undergrad and hadn't thought about it, but I did get really into printmaking and like intaglio and etching. And when I in grad school, Harry
also
Reese,
labor-intensive processes,
yes,
we should say.
Yeah, a labor-intensive process.
In terms
Yes.
of making that the image cannot get produced without a series of methods or processes that you have to etch onto a plate, that you cannot just produce an image by sketching directly onto a canvas or a piece of paper.
Exactly. Yeah, it has a lot of I like work that implies a limit and also has these steps that I can, like, I guess a lot of invisible labor, a lot of like I mean, in life there's all of just kind of like the dirt of living, all of the maintenance of feeding ourselves, taking care of people. And in art, these craft processes, you also you work with people often. In a print studio, you're around other people, you're working together. There's something that you can learn through repetition and kind of I love having parts of my practice that involve muscle memory and a craft that I've worked through over time. So Harry Reese in Santa Barbara, he's a bookmaker and a printmaker and a paper maker, very involved in artist books. And he introduced me to paper making. At the time I was making bamboo armatures and these suspended sculptures with different forms. Some of them were like these bound string forms, and some of them were these armatures of bamboo, but they kind of created these drawings in space, but I didn't have a taut surface to create any sort of like panel. And he suggested I look into paper making and look into abaca fiber. And abaca fiber is so beautiful. The more you beat the fiber, it becomes very mucosal. Like you're getting this kind of, you're pulling the mold through this gooey fiber that's been beaten in a paper beater for like 4 or 5 hours. The longer you beat it, the more beaten and masticated the fibers get, and the more they bind together.
And we should also just say that abaca fiber has it's a kind of tropical or semi-tropical species. It comes from it's a kind of banana leaf, I believe. And there's also a kind of history of people using it to twine or make rope or make netting or fishing lines. And so for me, that's a really interesting fiber property that links back to this idea of early forms of basketry that might have been influential to you. We've talked, you and I, about growing up in Ukiah, which is in an area or region of California in which Pomo Indians had a long legacy and history of making Pomo baskets, and particularly woven by women. Which you might have seen as a child at this very famous museum up in Ukiah that I've never been to, but you've spent time in, called the Grace Hudson Museum. So I guess, could you talk a bit about this idea of, I guess, fiber processes? Because there's definitely a fiber component here that is perhaps unseen without unpacking this link to abaca fibers.
Yes, yeah. So I grew up, I was born in Ukiah, but I grew up in Fort Bragg and Mendocino, but it's all, it's all out there, that whole area. And I did spend time in the Grace Hudson Museum and spent a lot of time looking at baskets and making baskets. I learned when I was like 8 how to make seaweed baskets at a nature day camp where you like soak the seaweed, and it's a big chunky, fiber. And then it dries out and it's really funky. So even if you're like an 8-year-old kid, your basket's going to look sculptural and interesting. So that's where it started. Seaweed baskets, and then also Pomo baskets are amazing. They're gorgeous.
And they're also kind of it's a series of twined
twined fibers, or it's sedge mostly. I've done some basketry with like willow roots. But my current work, I think it's kind of rooted in this plant knowledge that I've built up over time. But the bamboo I'm using is a more like refined like bamboo dowel. And the abaca fiber comes as linters that need to be beaten, but I'm still working against like a limit, I think, is the thing that really draws me to this way of working. Is you can bend the bamboo, you soak it, you bend it only so far before it breaks, so it kind of helps to delineate the forms. And with the abaca fiber, the more it's beaten, it becomes translucent, and it also shrinks as it dries. And I've done some sculptures that are, I'll just realize I thought I might do this where I just don't go through this.
Let's stop there. This is a very nice detail. And
sorry.
So when you talk about this idea of the bamboo bending or contorting, but only so far, it seems to me that there's this definitive relationship between the bamboo almost being a metaphor for like a ligament or a muscle structure in the body, and the translucency of the abaca becoming almost like a skin that you are stretching over these quasi bamboo ligaments, and that there's something intensely bodily about your process in making, but then also the kind of bodily frameworks that you are making in relation to the abstraction itself.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yes, exactly. Yes. The paper, yeah, I beat the abaca fiber until it's like mucus. It dries and becomes this very like, I don't work with animal skin, but it feels like that. It becomes skin-like.
And there is a history of people working before maybe it became out of fashion more in more recent years, but to work with hog gut.
Yes, yeah. It looks like hog gut, but it's not hog gut, but it has that same
Texture, like that sort of
texture.
when you say mucusy, that doesn't sound particularly appealing.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the fiber is like. I love it. I love that it gets very like the whole process becomes so bodily and involves so much water. You're draining this like this goopy fiber through the water, and then it dries. And if I let it only dry in the book press and then put the fiber, put the paper sheets on while they're still wet, it's strong enough to like bend plywood armatures. It has an like kind of incredible strength.
And so do you have to work quickly then before it dries, or can you re-wet it?
These pieces are all made with paper that has been dried in a book press. Basically, it's pressed and dried for multiple days, and then I can store it in my flat files and use it whenever.
So you're working from
and
flat sheets.
I'm working from flat sheets with these pieces because the wet paper would break the bamboo armatures. It's very strong. But this paper, when it's wetted, like I spray it to re-moisten it and then stretch it over the form. And as it dries, it shrinks. It still shrinks. It still has some of those properties. So it dries and becomes taut. And sometimes also it just kind of like ripples a bit where it's dried, in this way that makes it taut.
And are you able to add color while it's wet, or you're able to paint on it or make it sort of these different translucent colors? Because there's kind of like a pink and a light yellow and a jade green here, or kind of light green and a black. Are you painting? Are you applying color afterwards or during?
Both. Both. So I start with the palette of colors that I make while I'm making the paper. And I love having so much control over the color. Like I use pigments, dry pigments, and mix them with the fibers, and sometimes mix different colored fibers in the vat. So you have like a more mottled color, and you can get a lot of subtlety in your color when you're, in your paper, when you're making it by hand and adding the color in while you're making it. And
it's also kind of like a mobile because they kind of move in space as well, right? Like they kind of they rotate themselves. They're light enough once they are and supple enough that they can rotate.
Yes, they I'm not super motivated to make something that moves on its own continuously. These move more like in response to air currents and people coming close to them. And I have a lot of sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I have these eye motifs on the pieces that they're kind of like I think about false eyes actually on butterflies and defense mechanisms and the gaze. And with these, as you approach them, they move away. So you'll often see someone like looking in to see the details, and the pieces kind of recoil and they bring you in, but they also they move away.
Well, maybe that's their own defense mechanisms. Like you've anthropomorphized them and they've become like small petal-like insects or something.
Yes.
There's also a relationship here in terms of like the subtlety of air currents and translucency to an artist like Ruth Asawa.
I love her.
Do you want to sort of mention or talk about that work, or seeing sort of abstract women artists like Rosemary Mayer that I know you've been interested in, and sort of the idea of non-traditional, maybe process heavy work that's abstract and has these kind of biomorphic forms?
Yeah, I mean it's been highly like influential. Just well, one thing I love Ruth Asawa's work. I love that she did a lot of farm working, or she did a lot of like crafts and all these things, when she was younger, and it kind of like her her work, I love that she started with these coils, and like it just kind of grows out of a process, you know, it's like the process is where it starts in her work.
And for you as well, where you talk about this term, like you talk about plant knowledge and the idea of working as a young child with grasses and twine and basketry and, you know, nature camp. And those are, you know, those are maybe non-traditional. There may be, you know, everybody to their own experiences, it feels normalized, but that's kind of like a, you know, a kind of specialized knowledge to have gleaned, because that's not a traditional sort of crayon and paper way of working as a kid.
Yeah. I mean, I did do some drawing as well, and lots of like little books. But drawing always felt too direct as a way of working. And
I think that's really interesting, the idea of the indirect, that is more interesting to you, that direct would be sort of abstract work on a canvas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that you've chosen these processes that are incredibly labor intensive.
Yes. Yeah. Whenever I've worked on a canvas, it just gets built up and built up and built up, and it's hard to stop. So that's another like thing that happens with this work. I've done a lot of watercolor as well, and with watercolor, it's like if you overwork it, it's done. And with these pieces, I can work into them only so much, and I find that really comforting to have an endpoint. And also it allows me different ways of working. Some days I show up and I'm not ready to paint. I don't feel like making all of the choices of which colors to go where, and also it can get boring to be able to come to something and immediately like go to the answer.
And would you say that there's a kind of I don't know, like a failure that's, I don't know, maybe intuitive, or like a happy place in terms of like, if you bend so much, or you can rip something, or you can snap something, that there must be a whole series of failures along the way, because you've learned to understand, like you said, muscle memory with your materials, like you've learned to work with their limits.
Yes. Yeah. It lets you like, I like that space to fail. I mean, I don't know why watercolor comes to mind. I think because these have been like in a really nice groove, and every watercolor painting I've done lately has become overworked to the point of just like being cut up and reassembled into something different. But yes, I like having something to work against. And not, and you know, just to not have to know exactly where something's going to. I like that there's some mystery and collaboration when it comes to working with a process where not everything is, you know, like if something breaks, then you kind of work with the scraps. I feel like there's a lot of that ethos in this work. I used to in a lot of my early work right out of undergrad, I used to quilt as a motif. My great grandmother's quilt, like in these large sculptures, all like made all these quilts that people could sit on outside. And I was just thinking about today how that hasn't totally left, even though it's not there visually much. Because I'm always, when something breaks, it's like that piece becomes a smaller piece. And my with the paper, it's every single scrap fits somewhere and gets kind of stashed away, very much like when you're making a quilt and you save all the scraps of these paper are saved somewhere. So there's kind of like this satisfaction of using everything up too.
So would you say that that's a kind of I don't know, an ecological choice? Because there's also a kind of I think a budding interest from artists in particularly your generation and younger, in maybe being very clear or careful about what objects you put out into the world, given the state of rapid climate change and waste. And this sounds like a real commitment to reuse.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't know, especially, you know, I've brought Rose into this world, into a world on fire. And Sometimes it's at the front of my mind and sometimes I'm able to kind of suppress it. But I feel like there's a bit of mourning in a lot of my work, as far as just like the state of our world, and thinking like, oh, will she see whales when she's an adult? Like, and when I drive back up to Mendocino, the color of the water has changed because the kelp forests are dying. And you know, it's like I'm teaching her to have this. I'm gonna go to the slide here. This shows some earlier work. This piece is called Kite Hole. This is from 2014, and it's a hand-colored etching. And I've made a whole series of these where you're kind of inside of a hole looking out, and it's a California headlands landscape. And it has like some native plants, some non-native plants, and some like trash people have left behind. And all of the animals and plants are drawn in sort of a naive way that kind of emphasizes their characteristics. Like with the wild radish, like I draw each of the little flowers and like almost as if they're friends or someone that I know, and kind of how like they're kind of like caricatures. Like if you know someone and you think of their characteristics, versus if you're drawing a landscape as like, you know, a landscape in maybe more of a Western tradition where it's just like, oh, there is a hill, there is a tree, they're kind of all undifferentiated. They're not.
I love the fact that you know which is that. I don't know what the wild radish looks like. Is it the little pink flowers or the little pink ones?
It's actually not native, but it's edible. And you know, and then there's yarrow, which is native, coyote bush, which is native. And
is this the coyote bush? I'm just trying to.
Yeah, it's up here. It's like up at the top.
This one. Maybe you should do it with your
cursor. Okay, I'm kind of like lost as to where my cursor is, to be honest.
if you do it really fast, it might show up, and if not, it's okay.
Okay.
It also kind of has a fairy tale quality, or faux knife, like you said, but it reminds me a bit of Kiki Smith's later works. She did a lot of 90s practices that were specifically about the body and ritual, and a lot of sort of Catholic imagery, but then she flipped later and more recently to these working with master printmakers to create intaglio and etchings and lithographs about sort of fairy tale scapes, and revisiting sort of imagery from Hans Christian Andersen and various fairy tales that are often violent or encapsulate some sort of danger, or almost a foreboding or foreshadowing. And I wonder if this hole, the kite hole, or the idea of the owl, which might land and sort of has those talons, has that kind of quality of foreboding.
Definitely. I mean, the kite is actually that bird.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a type of hawk, and it hovers like a kite before it captures its prey. So if you're out on the headlands, sometimes you'll see a bird that's just like hovering, and that's a kite. So
we have those here, and now I have learned something now. I didn't know why they were called kites. Now you've made it very clear.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely this came out of just kind of just these feelings that are maybe more suppressed in my more abstract work, and more clear here, of just foreboding, and just, you know, and trying, and there's dramas between all the animals. Like, yeah, there's that mouse is about to get eaten, there's another mouse that's been eaten by the snake, and it's also just kind of this idea of that they all have their own, you know, internal lives that we're not necessarily noticing or thinking about. Even with the plants, I think just that they have their own like specificity that can be ignored. But I feel like when you know the names of them, and you kind of like are able to, not necessarily, I don't really want people to anthropomorphize animals or plants. Like this kind of treads that line. I feel like this work a little more so. But
also like root systems, the idea that people have done, I guess more recent publications point to the idea of plants being in contact with each other and communicating through these shallow and deep root systems.
Yeah,
which also has a kind of, not to anthropomorphize, but to me does feel like a metaphoric body.
Yes, yeah.
In terms of, our nerve systems, our lymphatic systems, it's hard not to map ourselves onto the planet.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think it's necessarily all bad to do so. Like, I think observation, like to be able to observe nature is something that let's see if these.
Oh, could you go back to the one? Do you want to talk about the show from 2017 that you just showed us briefly?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah. This is this shows some of my work from grad school and some work like that happened after grad school in 2017. It was curated together with Mary Button Durrell, who works with paper. She works with rice paper and glue and makes these kind of like cell-like shapes. And this installation shot, this show at Room was the first time I've had just these, I call them mobiles, even though they're not, but like the suspended, more insect flower-like sculptures. I hadn't ever installed those on their own, and I do love seeing them on their own. Usually I'd have these other sculptures kind of alongside. I call them knots, but there's these braided reeds that
have a detail that you could show us?
Sure. I mean, well, I don't have a detail of these braided reeds. I do have a detail of like
that's great.
Called needlework that's made with pine needles. The other sculptures that were braided with basketry reed and then coated with wet paper. And if you go back, you can see like the difference between the wet paper and the dry paper, like that whole sculpture, or the relief kind of painting sculpture in the background. That's made out of plywood, and the wet paper is just will warp it off the wall, and it will tighten around these forms in a different way that feels, it's a little bit more bodily than working with the dry paper. But yeah, this is made with by braiding pine needles, and then I kind of take apart the braids into smaller braids and work with the resistance of that braid. So it's a braid with like multiple strands.
It also kind of reminds me of a more natural version of Linda Banglis did a lot of ceramic knots or textile knots, in which she uses kind of day glow colors and glitter, and so they're very artificial, and they're about a kind of artifice, but the idea of a hanging knot, and not as a metaphor for untangling the psyche, maybe, or the knot itself has all knots have directions, so that when you untangle a knot, you have to figure out which way to push on a knot to get it to loosen. And that there's something very psychologically rich about the knot.
Definitely. I mean, it's also, I'm always kind of, I guess, working with my natural anxiety to some extent with everything I do. And this was a form of like, you can't let go of these sculptures while you're making them. You have to just sit there with your braid and keep going until it's done. And then kind of I use glue and paper to bind them in like one spot once I'm to the end of all the pine needles. But if you let go at any point, it's just like, it doesn't really work out. So it kind of forces me to basically meditate. It's a working meditation. It allows me to just take everything and put it somewhere, put it outside of myself a bit.
Or put it literally in a basket.
Yeah, I do put all my worries in a basket.
I mean, there is something metaphorically beautiful about that. And also the idea that this, once again, is a kind of limited, there's a limit that you've imposed upon yourself, in that if you put down the sculpture, it will undo itself, or it will not hold its shape, or it will, not manifest in some way. And so you're forced to keep going, and you're time limited in its creation.
Yes.
Like if you have to go do something else in life, you have to find a way to end it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And it allows me, I mean, I think it's worked really well since, okay, let's see, since becoming a parent. Like this was my last show before this one in 2019. I love that I can, Rose can go to preschool, I can go in my studio, there's always something to do. Like if I haven't slept well, I'm not going to make a bunch of decisions about a painting or like a, surface decoration of the work. I always have something to do that's, if I need to, I can make a knot. There's something to turn to, like within my muscle memory that'll, some work I can listen to an audiobook while I make it. Some work I have to be very focused, and to kind of have multiple ways of working, it keeps me going.
And would you say that there's that paper making it's a kind of niche subject matter? We've talked about this in the sense that it's hard to learn these days. It's particularly hard to learn within a university setting. There's very few places you can go and learn paper making anymore. Usually you have to go to a community workshop or a summer workshop or a camp, or it's aimed at children. So I guess, what does it mean to engage with this field that is very niche and also has a history of representing itself within the book or bookmaking? Because this is not bookmaking. I guess I want to be very clear. You are not doing bookmaking.
I'm not doing bookmaking. Okay, let's see. I don't know. I'm just thinking, like, did I show? I don't know which one to. Here you go. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not bookmaking. I have done a lot of printmaking. I taught printmaking at Davis, and I love a group studio. And I love craft, and I love having techniques to learn. And I mean, these are, in a way, although they're not books, they're kind of drawings. Like they're related to drawing and sculpture. And I've worked a lot in drawing and with with paper as something to draw on or to print on. So I have a relationship with paper, I guess.
But that's also a rejection. I think that there's something, the fact that these are bodily or that they move gently, it's also a rejection of the text or the cerebral qualities that sometimes we pair with paper.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. No, I mean, I love poetry. I struggle with writing about my work and writing generally. I struggle with language. When I was titling these pieces, I went to subtitles because I was just writing all these lists of like bodily plant names, and there are tons of them, but there's a lot of ones that are just cheesy or just like, I mean, it's language can be expansive, but I struggle with it sometimes.
That's a fair assessment. I think it's language is tricky.
Yeah, it's very tricky, and I want these to, I don't want anything to be boxed in. And I don't have a book in me. Like I was talking to someone who's working on a book, and I'm like, that's amazing. It's kind of like just outside of the scope of how I think. Like I have some poetry in me. I don't think I'm not a poet, but and I don't have like a narrative that I want to push with these, I guess.
Could you go to the Rosemary Mayer piece
Sure,
that
yes.
we added?
Yeah.
This is probably just useful for people who haven't seen her work. She's an artist who died in 2014. She was a feminist who lived in New York and was one of the founders of AIR Gallery, which was a feminist cooperative in the 70s. And she is also sort of somebody who's been influential to Vanessa in terms of thinking about these places of open forms. These are hanging textiles, rayon and cheesecloth, and this work is not in existence anymore. It's just an image at this point, but this idea of open form and closed form. And I guess I wanted to mention her in relation to language because she's somebody who struggled to balance her own desires between the need for language, and she did translation on the side. She had studied classical Latin, and her sister Bernadette Mayer was a poet, like an experimental poet. And then also the idea of just using language metaphorically in her titling like this with a balancing.
I love her work. I love her watercolors as well, which often pair like a word with flowers. Yeah, and it is, I mean, language, and I also, I guess, relate to the melancholy of her work. There's just like a lot of them are some sort of, are either a memorial to someone or a group of people who've been lost.
I think we actually have a question, so I'm gonna.
All right, great.
Anna, do you want to read the question for us?
Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from Jenni Sorkin. Says, you mentioned a few times how much you love the community aspect of the print and paper studios you worked in. Of course, the last few years, due to both changes from COVID and kid raising, you have to be more solitary while you work. How do you think that changed your practice, and what kind of practice and environment do you want to pursue in the future, is the question.
Thank you. That's a great question. It's been kind of, the past few years have been tough. But there's, I mean, I guess I've always been both very much a hermit and somebody who loves being in community with other people. So I've dug into the side of my practice that can happen just upstairs in my little home studio, and the meditative side. But I mean, my dream for the future, I'd love to build out a paper studio. There's not really in the Bay Area, there's not like a public or a paper studio that's like a group paper studio space. And it's a big dream, but I think that's like on my list of like sometime in the next 20 years, my big dream is a group paper studio. Similar, like I used to be a part of Graphic Arts Workshop in San Francisco. And I'd like to maybe try and secure residency at Collis soon. I mean, there's something, very synergistic about like, just being around people is great. And looking at other people's work and just kind of, being in the print studio for hours. I miss teaching in person, and like I when I was on Zoom teaching printmaking, I was trying to explain like the sound that ink makes when it's just the right texture. And there's just all of these just this embodied knowledge that you can't easily pass on online. And you just, yeah. So I miss like just talking through printmaking problems. And I'd love to one day have the opportunity to talk through paper making problems with people.
Great, thank you. We have another question. It's anonymous, and it goes, thanks so much for this conversation. What are you working on now, Vanesa? Anything coming up that should be on our radar?
Well, I'm working, right now, I mean, while Rose is on break, we're just like literally right now, I'm going to the zoo and the lake and Fairyland all the time, and it's a nice break for me as well. But I have lots of mobiles upstairs that are just in progress, and some that are in boxes. And I have a sculpture that I want to make, and like I want to work in textiles again a little bit, but also with monoprint and make large collapsible sculptures. I want to see these with something big and with a really worked surface. But that's gonna have to happen in a print studio. And as far as what's on the horizon, I'm actively trying to set up the next thing. But anyone who'd like to come visit me at my studio, just, reach out, please. I'd love to have you over.
Okay, we have a few more questions coming in. Another question is from Ashwini Buhat, and they're asking, when I think of plants, I immediately think of rootedness. But your way of playing with the mid-air space is very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about your interest in lightness? Thanks.
Oh, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot of gardening during the pandemic. So I'm familiar with like dirt. But I guess it's kind of like these are plants, but they're also insects, and they're also kind of human, and also maybe fish being caught. There's a little bit of like fishing, kind of references in there with they swivel on these like swivel mounts from like fishing. I did a lot of fishing when I was a kid. So it's like, yeah, this space that's in between all of those things. And it's a rooted space is more directly like plant life. And I feel like this floating space allows it to be more open and kind of speak to an underwater space or an animal or a plant or an insect. And they all have relationships with each other.
Okay, next question. This is from Allison Levi's, who's asking, hi, Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your work today. Given your work's connections to the natural world and natural processes, what is your attitude towards long-term preservation? If your sculpture were damaged in 50 or 100 years, would you want it repaired or prefer that it follow a natural trajectory of breakdown? This was the first part of the question. And there's another question that Alison is asking. I'm also curious about how/where you source your materials, especially natural ones like the pine needles we saw.
The pine needles are actually from my backyard. We have it's a pine tree. It grows usually in the Sierras. It's the type of pine tree used for basketry. And I was like, oh, wow, we have this pine tree in our backyard.
Maybe you should go back to your own work on the screen.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yes, thank you. All right, let's go to, thank you so much. And
I
then
think she's also asking, would you want your sculpture repaired or would you want to see it disintegrate?
It's a tricky one. I mean, I do repair my sculptures when they break. So I suppose I'd want them to be repaired. But I also, it's an interesting question. When you repair them though, there's like an obvious joint because it's, this thin bamboo rod. When it breaks, I repair it with paper and glue. And then it's just like it has a little cast or like a band-aid. Basically, it never quite blends in. So I suppose I'd like to see them mended, because that's what happens in my own practice or in my own studio. When they break, they get mended, or sometimes like the bamboo has joints, and when those snap, like when they're drying, I'll cut it apart and create like a new space in that area. So it's really, I guess, like I'd like someone to respond to it in a similar way as I do. But they are really delicate and, they may not last forever, and that's fine.
Okay, one more question is from Helen Cunningham, who's asking, you mentioned bodily limitations and defense mechanisms in these pieces. I love that they shy away from those close inspection. You also mentioned a tie-in to motherhood in the milk of Milkweed and the relationship between mother and child, which has a connotation of unrestrained giving. Is that something you were thinking about in these pieces?
Well, I was this piece, this is Milkweed. This is a close-up of Milkweed. And yeah, I mean, I think of like you can see this cutout here. There's like everything's kind of open and connected and kind of like permeable. I think a lot about like the permeability, and our vulnerability. I mean, particularly with COVID, people used to blow these back and forth, my work, when I was displayed at before COVID, like someone would stand on one side, someone would stand, or they blow the pieces back and forth and they swivel. And that was really charming then and terrifying now. And now sometimes I'm like, oh wow, this place has good ventilation. These are moving. So it's like almost like a ventilation indicator. So maybe I won't get so sick. Like I'm asthmatic and just kind of aware of like my body's limitations. Like autoimmune diseases are very unpredictable and hard to like describe and sometimes invisible, you know? So I'm sensitive to that, I guess. Think about it a lot. And in this piece with the permeable breasts, like I'm fascinated with the relationship when your breasts are chest feeding and the you know, the milk comes when the baby chooses, and you share antibodies, and there's just like, you know, we're just permeable, vulnerable creatures. So I think about that a lot.
I would love to piggyback on this or pivot slightly and just in our last few minutes mention this idea. Somebody had asked about, you had mentioned symbiotic creatures between plants and animals and people, but also the idea of communal print studios. And somebody had mentioned the idea of, you had mentioned maybe the idea of wanting to set up a communal papermaking studio at some point in the Bay Area. And I just want to mention, or at least give a shout out to Slash Art, who is sponsoring this talk and your show as a space that is for emerging artists in the Dogpatch neighborhood in San Francisco, a city that has seen more closures than openings in recent years, and is it's really nice to see this kind of communal atmosphere come back in the Bay, and the idea of young artists banding together to find the resources to support other emerging artists and their own peer group as a space for communal thinking and gathering like this. And I think that that's not a small thing. In our post-COVID moment, it takes a lot of group effort and a lot of work and a lot of individual artists putting their own practices on hold for the good of the community. And so I just wanted to also point that out as this extension of the idea of the communalism of your own practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I love Slash. Yeah, it's just in their main space, they have a library space, the room space, and the main gallery space, and they reach out to outside curators, and all the shows are fantastic and interesting. They put out publications alongside it. And the particular like the shows that are up right now, there's a real dialogue between them as well. Like there's a lot of like commonalities that just kind of happen by chance because everything's curated separately. And it's just beautiful. I really do love it.
Thank you both so much. It makes all of us very happy from the Slash team. It's really nice coming from you. I think it's a good moment to wrap it up, unless you two have anything else to add.
I think this is a good endpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you both. So this was such an engaging conversation, and thank you to audience for tuning in today and asking great questions. So Milkweed will be on view through August 19th. And it's alongside of Week to Water the Trees, as Vanesa mentioned. It's a group show curated by a Princeton Mint in our main gallery. And also in our library space, we have Notes on Culture Evidence on view. It's a show curated by PJ Guavitzina Policarpio. We hope that you will find time to come by to experience Vanesa's work in person. If you haven't already, or if you have, come back again. And thank you everyone for tuning in again. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Vanesa.
Thank you so much, Jenni, and thank you everybody for coming out.
Bye.
Bye.